a name that conjures fear, the most famous, the most iconic serial killer in history.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The violent story of the Ripper is so shrouded in myth that outlandish theories still surface, making it hard to separate fact from fiction. For the first time, we can present the truth about what actually happened. We bring the streets of Whitechapel in 1888 back to life to see the Ripper's dark world. Taking the original police reports, witness statements, and research by the world's leading authorities, and using maps and photographs, even lighting the streets as the murderer would have seen them, we reconstruct Whitechapel as it was then, revealing new clues about what really happened and who the Ripper really was.
She was cut up like a pig in the market.
This is the definitive story of Jack the Ripper. In the early hours of the morning, a 45-year-old prostitute named Emma Smith was walking through Whitechapel when she was savagely attacked. Her assault was the opening chapter of what is now known as the Autumn of Terror. A wave of extraordinary violence that horrified the East End and shocked the world. Though Emma Smith did manage to make it back to her lodgings, telling her friends she'd been attacked by 3 men, it was too late to help her. By the next day, she was dead.
They robbed her and they subjected her to a savage assault. In fact, they thrust a blunt object into her and then they left her.
The police began investigating her death, not realizing that it would become part of one of the biggest murder hunts in history.
You had drunken brawls, you had domestic violence, you had street robberies, and so something like an attack on Emma Smith wouldn't have seemed that unusual at the time.
Emma Smith certainly fits geographically with what one might think of Jack's kill zone.
I think it's unlikely that he started by committing a murder. You don't start with murder, you start with something less. Which over time escalated into his first murder. It's quite a common pattern.
London, in 1888, was the largest and wealthiest city on earth, the financial and commercial heart of the British Empire. Yet rubbing shoulders with the financial powerhouse of the City of London was an area of extreme deprivation, the East End. Yet for all the poverty, violence and hardship, murder itself was still uncommon in Victorian England. On average, the number of women murdered in London barely got into double figures. Martha Tabram was probably typical of thousands of women struggling to survive in the East End. After getting married to a warehouse foreman, she had been relatively well off, but following the birth of 2 children, she began drinking heavily. She ended up on the streets selling trinkets to survive.
The one main thing that really seems to unite the victims is the fact they were all forced to leave or kicked out of their family homes, and the main common factor amongst all these women's stories is the fact they were all alcoholics, you know, forced to lead these very tragic lives and drank because of it.
Monday, the 6th of August, was a bank holiday, and Martha had spent the evening drinking with her friend, Mary Ann Connolly, known by the nickname Pearly Poll. They'd ended up in one of the many local pubs. Tabram and Connolly met up with 2 soldiers, a private and a corporal, and spent until 11:45 drinking with them.
You're a lovely boy, ain't you?
Bet you know sometimes.
Connolly said that Tabram took her soldier to a narrow street called George Yard, which was entered through a covered archway from Whitechapel High Street. That night, the residents of George Yard buildings heard noises of unruly behaviour, but night noises of that kind were common, and they paid no attention. Mrs. Mahoney passed the murder spot, seeing nothing unusual. P.C. Thomas Barrett saw a soldier loitering near the Wentworth Street entrance to George Yard.
Evening, Corporal. Can I ask what you're doing here?
Waiting for a chum, he went with a girl.
Of course you are. Move along.
A gap of up to almost 4 hours separated Martha Tabram leaving the pub to her body being seen in a stairwell by a cab driver, but he paid no attention. If Martha had not been killed by her soldier companion, then there was plenty of time for her to have met somebody else. Her body was found lying in a pool of blood, and Dr. Timothy Colleen was sent for.
She had been dead some 3 hours. Her age was about 36, and the body was very well nourished. The left lung was penetrated in 5 places, and the right lung was penetrated in 2 places. The heart was penetrated in 1 place, and that would be sufficient to cause death. My opinion was that one of the wounds was inflicted by some kind of dagger, and that all of them were caused during life.
38 of the wounds on Tabram were inflicted with basically what they call a penknife, and 1 was inflicted with a much longer bladed knife, which penetrated right the way to her breastbone.
Martha Tabram had been the victim of a frenzied attack, stabbed nearly 40 times, all the wounds whilst she was alive. The police became convinced that Martha had been murdered by a soldier. P.C. Barrett, who had seen a soldier loitering near the entrance to George Yard, was certain that he would be able to recognise the man again.
So he was taken to an identification parade at the Tower of London, and he did identify 2 soldiers who he said he could have been the man, but both soldiers had cast-iron alibis.
Police attention moved to Pearlie Poll, but she failed to identify anyone at an identification parade at the Tower of London. But then Connolly said that the soldiers' caps had white bands. This meant that they had to be Coldstream Guardsmen stationed at Wellington Barracks near Buckingham Palace.
It's in.
Are you positive?
So.
Connolly picked out 2 soldiers, but both men were able to prove that they had returned to the barracks shortly before 11 that night and could have had nothing to do with the murder. The realization that Pearlie Poll was not going to lead them to the killer was a huge embarrassment for the police. The murder of Martha Tabram received a fair amount of press coverage, and comparisons were made with the brutality of the assault on Emma Smith, the similarity of their professions, and the geographical proximity. Martha Tabram's inquest ended with a verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown, a phrase that would reoccur with frustrating regularity as 1888 progressed. In their brutality and the targeting of prostitutes, the murders shared similarities with the Ripper's later killings. But were they the Ripper's work? Some are convinced that they were.
Emma Smith and Martha Tabram represent early exploratory questions, shall we say, being put forth to the world. When Jack next struck, he had a new formed image of what he wanted to do and what he was about.
And strike he would, just a few weeks later. Visit Whitechapel today, and you'd have no inkling of how the East End of London looked in 1888 when Jack the Ripper walked these streets. It was then a slum landscape, full of decaying buildings with a population of largely poor and destitute people, whose only home was a bed in a common lodging house, or if they were lucky, in a room in which the whole family had to live. Using computer-generated imagery and drawing on contemporary maps, plans and other documents, we can see this cramped area as it was then, a dense, confined warren of narrow streets where 2 unsolved murders had already been committed. Jack the Ripper was about to strike. But reconstructing the street as it looked then, Bucks Row is revealed as a short, narrow road, occupied on one side by a row of workmen's cottages and on the other by large warehouses. Yet seeing this simple layout is vital to understanding how the Ripper committed his crimes. At 20 to 4 in the morning, Charles Cross was walking to work along Bucks Row. He saw something on the ground against the gates and he went to investigate with another passer-by, Robert Paul.
I think she's dead. Look, let's move her. No, I'm not touching her. Besides, I'm going to be late for work. Let's at least sort her clothing out. She looks a right mess.
Cross and Paul headed off, hoping to report their find to a policeman. Soon after, PC John Neal entered Bucks Row on his beat. He saw the body on the ground. The woman who gazed back with sightless eyes had had her throat cut twice. One of the cuts went down to the spine. But what Neal didn't realize was that the woman had been hideously mutilated. The police summoned Dr. Rhys Ralph Llewellyn, whose surgery in residence was nearby. He was not required to do more than decide whether the person was dead or alive, and the police hurried to have the body removed to the mortuary.
Nowadays, if a similar murder had occurred, then the police would have cordoned the entire area off, forensics would come in, all the CSI would be done, and yet in those days they believed that the longer the body remained at the scene, then it became a place for sightseers to come. You could have public disorder from that. So the important thing was to get the body away from the scene of the crime as quickly as possible. But within an hour of the body being discovered, has been loaded onto the police ambulance and her body taken round to the mortuary. And then the scene is washed down. So the body is discovered at 3:40 a.m. in the morning, and by 6 a.m. in the morning, bloodstains have been washed away and the body's gone.
In the mortuary, the body was stripped by 2 attendants, and it was discovered that the woman had been disemboweled. Dr. Llewellyn was immediately summoned, and this time he made a thorough examination, later describing the woman's injuries in his testimony at the inquest.
2 or 3 inches in, on the left side, there was a wound running in a ragged manner. This wound was very deep. There were 3 or 4 similar cuts running downwards along the right side. All of these wounds had been inflicted by a knife, used violently and downwards.
He's not just stabbing, he's actually mutilating by opening up the genital area and then mutilating inside the rip that he's made. I mean, he does actually stab at her liver.
Dr. Llewellyn was of the opinion that the woman had been murdered where she lay, but that most of her blood had soaked into her clothes. The newspaper's interest in what had previously been seen as a local story now climbed to new levels, and Scotland Yard took charge of the investigation, sending in one of their top officers, Inspector Frederick Aberline.
Aberline was a hugely respected and popular inspector. He was returned from Scotland Yard because of his vast and intimate knowledge of the area. Basically, people knew him and he knew the people and how the area operated.
The victim was eventually identified as Mary Ann Nichols, known to everyone as Polly. She had started life as a servant before marrying William Nichols and having children.
William Nichols claimed in 1888 that the breakup of the marriage was due to Mary's drinking and alcoholism. Her father, Edward Walker, claimed differently, that William was having an affair with Rosetta Walls, who had a child by him in 1883.
It is easy to blame these women for ending their lives as drunks, But in 1888, life offered a woman few choices if the marriage went wrong. For Polly Nichols, that meant she had no alternative after leaving the marital home, but to spend the next 7 years drifting from workhouse to workhouse. According to the newspapers, things got so bad that she ended up sleeping rough in Trafalgar Square over the winter of 1887, joining hundreds of other homeless people who dossed there every night. That same winter, Trafalgar Square would become the focus of the notorious Bloody Sunday riots, when the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, deployed armed troops to violently suppress the demonstrators. Unscathed, Polly managed to find work as a domestic servant in Wandsworth, and in April 1888 she wrote a letter to her father.
I just write to say you'll be glad to know that I'm settled in my new place and going all right up to now. My people went out yesterday and have not returned, so I am left in charge. It's a grand place inside. They're teetotalers and religious, so I ought to get on. I hope you're all right and the boy has work. From yours truly, Polly. Answer soon, please, and let me know how you are.
He wrote back, but never received a reply. That was perhaps because Polly had been caught stealing from her employers and had absconded to the East End. Polly took lodgings in Thrall Street, the heart of a district known for its common lodging or doss houses, where thousands of poor and homeless people could have a bed for just 4p a night. But they had a fearful reputation as hotbeds of crime and immorality. Despite her troubles, Polly had somehow managed to preserve her looks. She was 43 years old and had some teeth missing, but the press reported that she appeared to be 10 years younger. In the final hours of the 30th of August, she was found in the kitchen of her Thrall Street lodging house.
Where's your money, Polly?
Sorry, I ain't got none.
Sorry, Polly. Rules is rules.
Never mind. I'll soon have my DOS money. See what a jolly new bonnet I have.
An hour later, one of Polly's friends, Emily Holland, bumped into her in Osborne Street.
Polly? You all right, love? Oh no, I've had me DOS money 3 times today. I've gone and spent it.
Why don't you come back to the lodging house?
Nah, got to get me DOS money somehow. Ta-ta.
Ta, dearie.
Polly walked eastwards towards the main road. It was the last time she was seen alive.
She was out looking for a customer. They all unwittingly contribute to their own deaths because they know they've got to go with a client to a dark place. She'd had 3 customers that day, but she was confident of getting a 4th customer because she'd got the bonnet.
See what a jolly new bonnet I have.
I'll soon get my 4th customer. That bonnet is going to attract somebody, and it does. In my opinion, the prostitute would have approached the customer, hand on the chest, hand up, what the phrase is now, and I shouldn't think it's changed much over the years.
Want the business.
Want the business. Polly Nichols took her customer round to Bucks Road by the old schoolhouse. I think she would have come through from Whitechapel Road through Woods' building, generally known to everyone as Piss Alley.
Seeing the streets as they would have looked then, it becomes clear that the murderer must have taken a considerable risk. Although the street was dark, there were streetlights near where the body was found, and people lived in the neighbouring cottages and in the adjacent Essex Wharf.
Assault takes place in a gateway, and it's adjacent to 2 rows of houses, and any cries or screams would almost certainly have been heard by somebody.
Harriet Lilly, who lived at number 7 Bucks Row, was awakened by a noisy goods train passing on the nearby railway line, and as the noise quietened, she heard some moans or gasps in the street, followed by whispering. But no other nearby residents heard anything. Mrs. Emma Green, who lived near the murder site, was typical.
Me and my daughter went to bed at 11 o'clock. We didn't see nothing after that. We slept right through. We were out like a light.
The authorities had managed to identify the victim, but they'd achieved little else. In the face of a growing general opinion that the Whitechapel killings had to be connected, the the police had been utterly unable to suggest a motive and were still clinging to the idea that they were gang-related.
Opinion is gaining ground that the murderers are the same who committed the 2 previous murders near the same spot. It is believed that these gangs who make their appearance during the early hours of the morning are in the habit of blackmailing these poor unfortunate creatures, and when their demands are refused, violence follows.
Not so long after the murder of Polly Nichols, a journalist did go back to the site of the Bucks Row murder and found that crowds were gathering there to discuss the murder, the murderer's motive, and who the murderer might have been. The consensus among the women was that the crimes were gang-related. But the reporter also spoke to an old man who actually told him that that's a got-up yarn. He said if it was a gang responsible for it, you can bet that one or t'other of them would have split on the others and it'd all come out. Bet you it's not been done like that.
The Ripper murders, as they would be known by the world for the next 120 years, had begun. With the murder of Polly Nichols, it was realized that there was a very unusual murderer at large. As our reconstruction shows, Jack the Ripper was acting spontaneously and very quickly, perhaps drawing on local knowledge. Jack strangled his victims from the front, causing blood pressure to fall and ensuring that there were limited blood spurts when, having lowered them to the ground, he quickly cut their throats twice to ensure their silence. The mutilation of the victims was performed post-mortem. That combination of extreme violence and opportunism would almost certainly mean that today the killer known as Jack the Ripper would be labelled a psychotic serial killer.
He strikes on the spur of the moment. There are some elements which involve planning, like avoiding the blood spatter, but basically brings his victims under control through blitz attacks. That's classic disorganised serial killer.
Mary Ann Nichols was buried on the 6th of September in a polished elm coffin supplied by a Hanbury Street undertaker. Ironically, in a little over 1 week, it would be the residents of Hanbury Street who would wake up to an even worse outrage, literally on their very doorstep. Three violent and exceptionally brutal murders had been committed in Whitechapel. The victims all prostitutes, all living locally. But while the police had no leads, the killer was about to strike again. Today, 29 Hanbury Street no longer exists. But carefully reconstructing the street as it was then reveals number 29 as a 3-story building with a garret for a 4th floor. In 1888, the 8 rooms in this one-time family home were occupied by 17 people. The front door opened into a hallway leading the length of the house to a rear door, and beyond that, a yard.
Annie Chapman was probably born in Paddington in 1840 and was married in 1869, and a photograph that has been passed down to a descendant shows what looks like a marriage photograph with her and her husband John.
This is the only remaining photograph of any of the victims while they were alive. It suggests that a respectable and happy future was assured for the young couple, but that was not to be.
Annie and her husband and the children were based in a place called Clewer in Windsor, and for many months John was working as a coachman and domestic servant for this rich baronet.
But Annie was an alcoholic and would be seen wandering through the countryside drunk. She was an embarrassment to her employer.
The baronet didn't want her on the estate anymore, so John was forced to separate from Annie. Whether he did that gratefully or reluctantly, I guess we'll never know.
Annie Chapman ended up in the East End, in 1888 living at Crossingham's lodging house in Dorset Street. Dorset Street was lined with decaying buildings, most converted into common lodging or doss houses, some catering for as many as 400 people every night. A notorious thoroughfare, known for its disreputable characters and lawlessness. While at Crossingham's, she was involved in a fight with another lodger named Eliza Cooper. Accounts of the incident vary, but whatever the truth, The fight left Annie bruised and battered.
Next time I'll have you!
According to the subsequent investigation, on the late afternoon of September the 7th, Annie was seen by a friend in Dorset Street.
Annie? I thought you was going to Stratford this morning.
I was, but I feel too ill. Oh, anyway, I must pull myself together and go and get some money, or I shall have no lodging.
In the early hours of the next morning, she was found eating a baked potato in the Doss House kitchen by the night watchman, John Evans, who'd been sent to collect the Doss money.
You've got your Doss money?
She didn't have it.
No, well then you know the rules. Come on, off you go with you. Come on.
He watched her leave and make her way down Little Paternoster Road towards Spitalfields. By carefully piecing together the testimony of people in Hanbury Street in the early hours of that morning, it is possible to come to a likely scenario of what must have happened. At 5:30, Elizabeth Long was walking past number 29 Hanbury Street on her way to Spitalfields Market when she saw a woman who she believed was Annie Chapman standing with a man hard by the shutters of the house.
Will you?
Yes.
She was certain of the time as she had just heard the brewery clock strike the half hour.
I did not see the man's face, but I noticed that he was dark. He was wearing a brown, low-crowned felt hat. By the look of him, he seemed to me a man over 40 years of age. He appeared to me to be a little taller than the deceased. I should say he looked like what I should call shabby genteel. I left him standing there, and I did not look back.
At about the same time, Albert Kadosh, who was suffering a urinary infection, made one of several visits into next door's backyard to visit the outside toilet. Kadosh heard what he thought was something fall against the fence in the yard next door, but thought nothing of it. He left for work, but did not see Mrs. Long or anyone standing outside number 29. It was in the yard of number 29, less than 30 minutes later, that Annie Chapman's mutilated body was found by resident John Davis.
Here, there's a woman in the yard there. There's been another murder.
It was immediately clear that Annie Chapman had been the subject of an attack of unprecedented ferocity. Dr. Bagster Phillips conducted the post-mortem.
There were two distinct clean cuts on the left side of the spine. They were parallel with each other and separated by about half an inch. The muscular structures appeared as though an attempt had been made to separate the bones of the neck. The abdomen had been entirely laid open. The intestines, severed from their mesenteric attachments, had been lifted out of the body and placed on the shoulder of the corpse, whilst from the pelvis, the uterus and its appendages, with the upper portion of the vagina and the posterior 2/3 of the bladder, had been entirely removed.
The killer, as we see, his fury keeps increasing. This is part of his progression.
Dr. Phillips' cataloguing of the injuries suggested to him that the killer had to be a medical man, or at the very least, someone who had a working knowledge of anatomy. And his conclusions about the time of death and how much time was needed to perform the mutilations would help build the myth that Jack the Ripper was a doctor.
Obviously the work was that of an expert, of one, at least, who had such a knowledge of anatomical or pathological examinations as to be enabled to secure the pelvic organs with one sweep of the knife.
Dr. Bagster Phillips' conclusion that the murderer possessed anatomical or pathological knowledge and had sufficient skill to quickly cut out the organs encouraged the police to begin investigating doctors and medical students. But our reconstruction shows that some of Dr. Phillips' conclusions may have misdirected the police investigation. From his examination of the corpse, Dr. Phillips put the time of death at 4:30, or possibly earlier, but John Richardson had been sitting on the top step at 4:45, 15 minutes after the time of death estimated by the doctor, but did not see a body, nor did he smell a disemboweled corpse. Then there was the evidence of Albert Kadosh, who left his home at 5:30. The same time Annie Chapman had been seen in the street by Elizabeth Long, but he saw nobody. Long had been certain of the time thanks to the brewery clock, but if she'd heard it strike the 1/4 instead of the 1/2, her version would tie in with Albert Kadosh. If they were right, then Bagster Phillips had to be wrong about the timing of the murder, and Annie Chapman was coldly murdered in broad daylight.
The science of determining time of death by body temperature is rather arcane, and certainly the accepted practice today of taking rectal temperature was not part of Dr. Bagster Phillips's assessment at the time. It was a relatively cold morning, her body had been majorly eviscerated, and she'd lost a lot of blood.
As the morning wore on and news of the murder spread, public anxiety turned into panic. Residents of the neighbouring houses did brisk business renting out rooms that overlooked the yard to curious onlookers.
During the whole of Saturday and yesterday, a large crowd congregated in front of the house in Hambury Street. Great complaints are made concerning the inadequate police protection in the East End, and this want is even admitted by the local police authorities themselves.
So you had sort of the radical newspapers who used the murders really to have a go basically at the police. You also had elements of the press that were looking into the philanthropy of it all. For example, with Mary Nichols and Annie Chapman, these two ladies were sent to their deaths simply because they didn't have fourpence. Had they had the fourpence to pay for their beds in their common lodging houses, then they wouldn't have been out on the streets. And of course then you had the sensational newspapers. These horrors in the East End of London are happening, and there's a bogeyman out there. I think every newspaper had an agenda that they used the murders for.
It was newspaper pressure that also led to the first significant arrest in the case, as the Star newspaper pushed its pet theory that a mystery Jewish man known as Leather Apron was behind the deaths. In one particularly lurid account, the Star described him as a noiseless midnight terror who preyed on the local prostitutes.
When the body was found in the yard, close to the body was a freshly washed leather apron. Now, as it transpired, this belonged to a resident of number 29 Hambury Street. His mother had found it in a cupboard, washed it and put it out to dry. However, certain elements of the press latched onto this because it fed nicely into the leather apron scare.
Suspicion quickly fell on a man named John Pizer, a Jewish slipper maker who went by the same nickname of Leather Apron. On 10th of September, Sergeant Thick went to Pizer's home in Whitechapel.
Ah, you are the man I want. I'm arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Annie Chapman.
Various newspapers heaped abuse on Pizer, but unfortunately for the police, he was able to prove that he was nowhere near Whitechapel on the night of the murders. But the Leather Apron scare did much to fuel anti-Semitism in Whitechapel. East London had become a home to Russian Jewish refugees following the anti-Jewish pogroms that had come in the wake of Tsar Alexander II's assassination in 1881. Many had undergone extreme hardship in their desperate efforts to find safety in the East End. The change in the area's fragile ethnic balance had resulted in a rise of violent anti-Semitism.
So you now get a great deal of policing in the area, and this certainly does bring the anti-Semitism under control, and made it almost impossible, if you like, for the killer to strike again. So for a brief period of time, the people of the East End got a respite from their autumn of terror.
That did not stop the radical press continuing to use the murders to fuel their attacks on the police and the Home Office.
And when public opinion is at last aroused and the whole East End is under a red terror, if a mad panic sweeps through the quarters, desolated by a maniac's knife, the Home Office and Scotland Yard will be alone to blame.
Annie Chapman was buried in an unmarked grave on the 14th of September 1888. The inquest jury returned yet another verdict of willful murder against person or persons unknown.
Dark Annie's spirit still walks Whitechapel, unavenged by justice. Her dreadful end has compelled Londoners to reflect what it must be like to have no home except the kitchen of a low lodging house. To sit there, sick and weak, bruised and wretched, to be turned out after midnight, to come across your murderer and caress your assassin.
4 unsolved murders, an angry press, and a complete lack of firm clues. The police were still no closer to any kind of arrest. Then the Central News Agency received a letter which would give the murderer a special place in the history of crime. It was addressed to the boss and written in red ink. Though it claimed to be from the killer himself, at first they treated it as a joke. But realizing its potential significance, the agency sent it on to Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the head of the investigation at Scotland Yard.
Dear boss, I keep on hearing the police have caught me, but they won't fix me just yet. I have laughed when they look so clever and talk about being on the right track. That joke about leather apron gave me real fits.
There really is nothing to prove that this letter was written by the murderer himself, and senior police officials of the time and modern commentators have suggested it came from the pen of a journalist. But what makes this letter significant and important is it's the one that gave us that name.
Yours truly, Jack the Ripper.
The name was a work of genius, and when the murderer struck again, the press would be proclaiming the most famous name in criminal history. Jack would soon return to the streets, and in a more shocking way than anything seen before, he would commit 2 murders on the same night. With 4 unsolved murders, Jack the Ripper would soon strike again, with a murder on the 30th of September of a 43-year-old woman. She would be the first of 2 victims that night in what later became known as the double event. Burner Street off Commercial Road was some distance from the other murder sites. This is what it would have looked like that autumn evening. The east side of the street was a row of houses. One of these was used as a fruit and vegetable shop. On the corner there was a pub. Number 40 was an old 3-story building that had been turned into a socialist club. Along the side was a passage leading into Dutfield's yard. It was here, in the early hours of the 30th of September, that the body of a woman would be found. Her name was Elizabeth Stride.
Elizabeth Stride was actually born in Sweden, in a little town called Torslanda. She grew up in a family of 4. When she was older, she went to live in Gothenburg. After working in domestic service, she fell foul of the law as she was recorded as a prostitute. Elizabeth had a stillborn child in about 1865. It was considered that it probably died because she was suffering from a sexually transmitted disease. In 1869, she marries a man named John Thomas Stride. He's a carpenter. They have their own coffee house at Poplar for a short number of years.
Elizabeth was reasonably well educated, bright and intelligent, a linguist, and able to run a business. But things would go wrong. Elizabeth's relationship with John Stride broke up, and she ended up living in a Whitechapel doss house. On 29th of September, Elizabeth was seen drinking in a pub called the Queen's Head. She then returned to her lodging house to smarten herself up to go out.
Charlie!
Yeah?
Can I borrow your brush, Charlie?
You could if I could find the bloody thing.
Charlie.
At 11 p.m, 2 labourers were entering the Bricklayers Arms on Settle Street. As they went in, they saw Elizabeth leaving with a man.
Yeah, that's leather apron getting around you, that is.
He was described as short, with a dark moustache and sandy eyelashes. He was wearing a billycock hat and a morning suit and coat. Elizabeth and the man walked quickly away toward Commercial Road. About this time, Matthew Packer claimed to have sold grapes to a couple who came to his shop next to Dutfield's yard. His story received widespread publicity and passed into folklore. However, no remains of grapes were found in Stride's stomach. 45 minutes later, William Marshall saw Elizabeth with a man on Burner Street.
I'd say anything,
As the meeting in the club finished, many people left for home, and for a while the street was busy. Inside the club, some members stayed on to join in some singing. The earlier rain had stopped, and the air was fresh. Around 12:35, P.C. William Smith saw Elizabeth with a young man opposite the club. He was described as 5'7" in height, wearing a dark overcoat and a felt deerstalker hat, and was carrying a newspaper parcel. 5 minutes later, Maurice Eagle came through the gates of Dutfield's yard. He saw nothing unusual. At 12:45, James Brown left a chandler's shop at the junction of Burner Street and Fairclough Street. He passed a woman and a man standing by the board school. Brown did not recall the woman wearing a flower, so it's possible he saw an entirely different couple.
Not tonight. Some other night.
At the same time as Brown's sighting, perhaps the most important incident of the entire investigation was witnessed by Israel Schwartz, a 22-year-old man described as being of Jewish appearance, who spoke no English. The head of the police investigation, Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, was later to give to the Home Office a comprehensive account of what Schwartz saw.
The man tried to pull the woman into the street, but he turned her around and threw her down on the footway. And then she screamed 3 times.
Israel Schwartz thought it was a domestic argument, and he didn't want to get involved, so he crossed over the road to avoid doing so.
On crossing to the opposite side of the street, he saw a second man standing lighting his pipe. The man who threw the woman down called out to the man apparently on the other side of the road.
Lipsky!
Schwartz walked away, but finding that he was followed by the second man, he ran as far as the railway arch, but the man didn't follow so far. Schwartz can't say whether the 2 men were together or known to each other. Upon being taken to the mortuary, Schwartz identified the body as that of the woman he had seen.
The first man, the man who was carrying out the attack, he described as being about 5'5". He said he had a fair complexion, he had dark hair, he had a small brown moustache, thick-set built, and he wore a peak cap. Now the other man, he said that he was about 5'11", he was about 35, had a fair complexion, he wore an old dark felt hat, and he held a clay pipe in his hand.
The Home Office asked for an explanation of the word Lipsky,
Lipsky!
and was told that since the previous year when a Jew named Lipsky was hanged for murder, the name had been used to insult Jews. Another crucial witness was Fanny Mortimer, who lived just 25 feet from the murder spot.
I was stood in my doorway sometime between 12:30 and 1 o'clock. Well, I went outside shortly after I heard the measured stamp of a policeman on his beat. Well, I was in my door no more than 10 minutes. The only person on the street was a young man carrying a black shiny bag.
This man was Leon Goldstein, who was passing through Burner Street at 12:55, placing Mrs. Mortimer at her door between 12:50 and 1 a.m., a matter of minutes after Schwartz had witnessed the attack outside Dutfield's yard. This means that the footsteps she heard and believed belonged to a policeman might well have been those of the murderer leaving the murder scene. Looking at Burner Street, as it would have appeared on that fateful night, it can be seen that Elizabeth Stride's body, just inside the passage to Dutfield's yard, would not have been visible to Mrs. Mortimer, even though she was only a matter of yards away. Mrs. Mortimer went back inside, and a few minutes later she heard a pony and a cart pass by. It was a jewellery salesman named Louis Deemschutz. But on turning into Dutfield's yard, Deemschutz's pony shied to the left and refused to go further. The reason soon became apparent. There, at the corner, lay the body of Elizabeth Stride. Her throat had been cut. With 4 women murdered, the police no nearer an arrest. and the public's mounting panic fueled by press speculation, the discovery of a fifth murdered woman in Berner Street was met with disbelief. But the Ripper had not finished his work for the night. Before morning, there would be a sixth body, that of Catherine Eddowes. By late September 1888, there had been 4 unsolved murders of prostitutes in Whitechapel. On the night of the 29th of September, Elizabeth Stride was found in Berner Street with her throat cut. She would be only the first of Jack the Ripper's victims that night.
Elizabeth Stride was different to all the other victims because she only had her throat cut. She had no abdominal mutilations.
Dr. Frederick Blackwell was summoned by the police from his nearby surgery.
At about 10 minutes past 1, I was called to 40 Berner Street by a policeman where I found a woman who had been murdered.
More light.
Her head had been almost severed from her body, and in her hand she held a box of cashew. One of her hands was smeared with blood, suggesting that she struggled. She could not have been dead more than 20 minutes.
Dr. Blackwell put the time of death at between 12:46 and 12:56 a.m.
When the body was undressed, it was noted that there was a bluish discoloration over both shoulders, especially the right, and under the collarbone and in front of the chest. These marks were produced by pressure from 2 hands.
Stride's death was different from the others, that she was attacked from behind. She was wearing a scarf. This was pulled tight as she was jerked backwards. The murderer, I suggest then, grips both shoulders and bangs her down onto the ground. This would explain the bruising on the backs of the shoulders. He could have rendered her very quickly unconscious and then, rotating the head, cut the left carotid artery, which was the method he used on the other victims, and in cutting the throat, he cuts the edge of the scarf, giving it a frayed appearance.
Could you tell me?
The following day, Israel Schwartz went to the police with an interpreter and gave them the best description they had had so far of the possible killer.
He is quite an important witness in that he saw Elizabeth Stride being attacked 15 minutes before her body was discovered.
After leaving the police station, Schwartz was followed by a reporter for the Star newspaper who tracked him to his lodgings.
Excuse me, I wondered if I could have a word with you and Mr. Schwartz. I gather you saw something?
Did he? Looks like he saw the whole thing.
Really? Very interesting.
The Star report contained a potentially significant additional detail, that the attacker, seen by Schwartz, had pushed the woman by the shoulders into the yard. Although the passage was dark, our reconstruction of the street lighting reveals that Schwartz would have had a clear view of the man's face. But was he Jack the Ripper? The fact that Elizabeth Stride was not mutilated might suggest that she was the victim of another killer. But the reconstruction of what happened that night suggests a far more likely explanation, that the Ripper had indeed attacked Elizabeth Stride, but had been disturbed.
A murderer is an opportunist. The courtyard was very busy. There was a concert performance going on in the rooms behind him, so there would have been light in the courtyard. The gate was open and the entranceway visible for anyone walking down the street or coming through the gate, as did Deemschutz, the travelling salesman who discovered the body. I think he was hoping for time to perform his mutilations, which I suspect he was planning. But the location was wrong, the timing was wrong.
He cuts her throat. There are no other significant injuries. He is observed launching the sort of blitz attack that disorganised serial killers use to bring their victims under control. 2 people see him doing this, and he thinks, hold on, wait a minute, they might have gone for the police. I'd better get out of here.
He was killed by a cut. She was not mutilated because he didn't have the time. He was doing it among other people, and therefore he ran off and very shortly afterwards committed another crime, which was more his usual presentation. It makes sense.
That next attack would come just 40 minutes later, on the fringes of the City of London, a little more than a mile away.
Come on, clear off the lot of you. There's nothing to see here.
Come on.
Earlier that evening, PC Louis Robinson had noticed a small crowd of people standing around a woman in Aldgate High Street. It was 46-year-old Catherine Eddowes, and he arrested her for being drunk and disorderly.
Catherine was born in Wolverhampton in 1842, and she was one of 12 children. In 1861, Catherine became a domestic servant. But then she's caught stealing at some point, and so she runs away, and she meets Thomas Conway in Birmingham. We've found no marriage certificate for Catherine and Thomas, but they acted as common law husband and wife and had 3 children. And then in 1881, Catherine and Thomas separated. He basically blamed Catherine's drinking.
She took up with John Kelly, a labourer and jobber in Spitalfields Market.
How do you know Kate?
We were thrown together a good bit. The result was that we made a regular bargain. We have lived here ever since, as the people here will tell you.
When returning from hop-picking in Kent, Catherine was given a pawn ticket that would ultimately lead to the identification of her mutilated body.
I've got a ticket for a shirt which might fit your old man.
Oh, Tara, love. Bless your heart.
The hop-picking had been so poor that they had returned to London penniless.
We're wiped out, John.
Don't worry, I'll get some work, yeah?
I'm going to go to my daughter's in Bermondsey, get some money off her.
She said she was going to her daughter's in Bermondsey to borrow some money, but whether that was her real intention or not is not known.
Don't think she had any intention of going to Bermondsey because she knew that her daughter wasn't even living there anymore. But where she was going and who she was going to see, I guess we'll never know.
What we do know is that Catherine Eddowes came face to face with Jack the Ripper. Five prostitutes had been violently murdered, and soon there would be a 6th. In the early hours of September the 30th, the Ripper had already killed once, but had been disturbed. Now, his lust for blood was going to lead him to kill again. Catherine Eddowes was about to be released from Bishopsgate Police Station.
What time is it?
Too late for you to get anything to drink.
I'm going to get a damn fine hiding when I get home.
Serves you right. You had no right to get drunk.
Good night, old cock.
Rather than heading for her lodgings, on leaving the police station, she turned left towards Houndsditch. It would prove a fateful decision. Mitre Square, just within the boundary of the City of London, was surrounded on all sides, mostly by tall warehouses. Poorly lit, it was patrolled every 15 minutes by PC Edward Watkins.
Mitre Square had 3 lamps in it. There was one in the entrance from Mitre Street, there was one in the entrance to Church Passage. These were both fixed to the wall. There was also a freestanding lamp across the way, but this was deemed deficient. Either it was not working completely, or it could be the faulty gas line, or even poor gas being used.
PC Watkins would later testify.
It was 1:30 when I turned out of Aldgate and passed around the next corner into the square. There was nothing unusual to be seen. I turned my lantern light in every direction. I'm positive there was nothing wrong at that time.
Five minutes later, 3 men leaving the Imperial Club in Duke Street made an important sighting. A woman was seen talking to a man at the entrance to Church Passage, a narrow alley which led into Mitre Square. Only one of the men, Joseph Lavender, took much notice of the couple.
I like walking home by myself, people like that around.
He described the man as of shabby appearance, about 30 years of age, and 5'7" or 8 inches in height, of fair complexion, having a small fair moustache and wearing a red neckerchief and a cap with a peak. At 1:40 a.m, PC James Harvey walked through Church Passage, stopping short of Mitre Square, which wasn't part of his beat. Had he entered it, he might well have seen the murder.
It was possible that Catherine Eddowes was in the corner of Mitre Square with her murderer as PC James Harvey came down Church Passage, and that he actually missed the couple in the corner.
Minutes later, PC Watkins came into the square and discovered the mutilated body of Catherine Eddowes.
I can tell you, it didn't take me a moment to see the Whitechapel murder had been our way. She was cut up like a pig in the market. I've been in the force a long time, but I never saw such a sight.
The throat had been cut to the spine, and the knife had marked the cartilages in the vertebrae. And in this case, the killer had gone further still, leaving Eddowes' face completely mutilated. The tip of her nose had been cut off, and there were cuts in the eyelids and one of the ears, as well as triangular cuts to the cheeks. The face was so badly mutilated that she could not be identified from published descriptions, and her identity was only established when John Kelly recognized the pawn ticket she'd been given by Emily Birrell. When Watkins found the body, he sought help from George Morris, a night watchman who worked only a few yards away.
God's sake! Come to my assistance!
And Morris, being an ex-Met police officer, had a whistle, and it was he that blew the whistle and raised the alarm.
From what the eyewitnesses saw in and around the square that night, it's clear that the murderer must have conducted his savage attack in a matter of minutes. And the careful reconstruction of the lighting in the square reveals that he must have acted in almost total darkness.
You could say that they were opportunistic killings, that he took a huge amount of chances. And I think that's true. I think one reason why he took these chances is that he might not have been very bothered about the possibility of being caught.
The injuries were inflicted very quickly, however they could not have been performed in under 5 minutes, and a long pointed blade of at least 6 inches was used.
The facial mutilations carried out on Catherine Eddowes were almost certainly random slashes. We know this because Dr. Frederick Gordon Brown, who attended the inquest, noted in minute detail every single cut and slash perpetrated on her body.
The killer would have had to have a good deal of knowledge about the positions of the organs within the abdominal cavity.
Eddowes' abdomen had suffered a long zigzag cut reaching all the way from the base of the sternum down to the pelvis, and it was through this single opening that the Ripper was able to remove both her uterus and her left kidney. But there's no reason to believe that a Ripper simply reaching into the abdomen and grabbing any object of interest and cutting it out couldn't have done so with no surgical training whatsoever.
However, a butcher could perhaps possess this knowledge.
Dr. Brown's evidence produced a significant shift in the police investigation. Instead of looking for medical men, they now began looking for someone local who might know something of human anatomy. Shortly after the body was found, just a few streets away, a policeman made a startling discovery. A piece of what proved to be Eddowes' apron, covered in blood and feces. Above the apron was a message.
He saw a blood trace upon the wall, followed the trace up, and that's when he saw the wall writing.
One version has it that the Jews are not the men that will be blamed for nothing, or the Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing.
But the location of the message and the piece of apron, just a few streets from Mitre Square, but in the direction of Whitechapel, might also be a vital clue.
The discarded apron suggests that he was heading back. I would suggest to his home, to his hideout. Geographical profiling, which you use in modern murder investigations today, has him living within about 200 yards of Dorset Street. And it suggests that this was his hideout. This is where he's heading back to.
What is clear, however, is that the police did not make the best of this information.
The two murders took place in different police areas. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square, so she was murdered in the City of London, and that brought the City of London police into the investigation.
What caused the disagreement was the message's inflammatory racial content.
That is evidently anti-Semitic graffiti. So the Metropolitan Police are remembering now the leather apron scare. 6 a.m. on the morning of the 30th of September, you're going to have the Petticoat Lane street market. But that graffiti pertains to an investigation being carried out by the city police. And what the Met sees as incitement to racial violence, they see as an important clue, and they want to photograph it. And so you've got this argument going on until at 5:30 in the morning, Sir Charles Warren turns up. He's in charge. He took one look at that. He said, no, it goes. And so it was the most controversial order probably that he gave of the entire investigation, that the writing or the graffiti was erased before a photograph of it could be taken.
The police desperately needed a break in the investigation, something to assuage public fears about the murderer. The following day, the press published the Dear Boss letter in tandem with another missive, this time a postcard.
I was not codding, dear old boss, when I gave you the tip. You'll hear about Saucy Jackie's work tomorrow. Double event this time. Number one squealed a bit, couldn't finish straight off, had not time to get the ears for the police.
This second communication appeared to have been written by the same hand as the Dear Boss letter.
Jack the Ripper.
As a consequence, the murders are now turned almost into a street pantomime, and 5 sordid East End murders became an international phenomenon, and the unknown miscreant responsible for those murders was elevated to the realm of legend.
On October the 3rd, the police began a house-to-house search that took over 2 weeks to complete. 100,000 handbills were distributed, but as the press reported, not the slightest clue to the murderer was obtained.
The police do a trawl through the area. In fact, Sergeant Thick told the journalist the inquiries were taking forever because each of the common lodging houses in Dorset Street could accommodate between 200 and 350, 400 people.
We don't know the kind of man the police were looking for, but in later years, Scotland Yard's man on the ground in Whitechapel, Frederick Aberline, advanced a theory of his own. Aberline believed the most likely killer was a Pole named Severin Klasowski, who also called himself George Chapman.
There are a score of things which make one think that Chapman is the man. You must understand that we've never believed all of those stories about Jack the Ripper being dead or a lunatic or anything of that kind. The date of the arrival in England coincides with the beginning of the first series of murders in Whitechapel. The fact that he studied medicine and surgery in Russia.
Kozlowski's a compelling subject because he's known to have murdered 3 of his wives. He did so by poisoning them, which is possibly where his previous surgical training in Poland came into some sort of practical use.
It's curious to note that the first series of murders was the work of an expert surgeon, while the recent poisonings proved to have been done by a man with more than an elementary knowledge of medicine. The story told by Chapman's wife about the attempt to murder her with a long knife while in America is not to be ignored.
The Chapman theory, whilst given additional credibility by being advanced by no less an authority than Aberline, suffers from one fundamental flaw. Why would Jack the Ripper have suddenly changed from throat cutting to poisoning? The house-to-house investigation had produced no lasting suspects. Neither did the publication of the famous letters. The police were deluged with hoax communications, one of which stood out. George Lusk, a prominent local businessman and president of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, received a small package.
From hell. Mr. Lusk, sir. I send you half the kidney I took from one woman, preserved it for you, t'other piece I fried and ate. It was very nice. I may send you the bloody knife that took it out, if only you wait a while longer. Signed, Catch me when you can, Mr. Lusk.
A kidney had been removed from Catherine Eddowes' body and apparently taken away by her murderer. No one knows if the kidney sent to Lusk really had belonged to Eddowes or whether the message was from her killer. It was, nevertheless, chilling in the extreme. Jack the Ripper had everyone on his trail, including 2 London police forces and the country's top detectives. His elusiveness was nothing short of miraculous. The double-event murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes horrified the public and press alike. But October would pass without a murder, and a slight sense of normality returned to Whitechapel. But the killer would strike again, and this time he would commit his most horrendous crimes so far. Mary Jane Kelly was just 25 years old and lived in a small rented room in Miller's Court, just off Dorset Street, the insalubrious thoroughfare which had once been home to Annie Chapman.
There's some more stuff about the murders. It says another revolting murder, more horrible than the previous one left in Bucks Row.
The stories and myths surrounding Mary Jane Kelly's life are many because the name is extremely common. The information that was given is that she was born in Limerick in Ireland, and when she was a small child she came across to Wales in Carmarthenshire. Her father was said to be a ganger of an ironworks there, but unfortunately for some reason Mary Kelly made her way to Cardiff to stay with a cousin, where it was said that she became a prostitute.
Kelly, who was reportedly an attractive young woman, eventually came to London, and according to her own story, she worked for a while in a posh brothel in the West End, where she had fine dresses and all the trappings that went with catering for a high-class clientele. She even claimed to have been taken to France by a gentleman. But if her story was true, something seems to have gone horribly wrong, because she made a swift decline into the stews of Whitechapel. In April 1887, she met a market porter named Joseph Barnett, and they almost immediately agreed to live together. They moved from one lodging to another, but eventually ended up at 13 Miller's Court. Miller's Court was entered through a narrow arched passageway about 20 feet long and a yard wide, which ran between number 26 and 27 Dorset Street. 13 Miller's Court could only be entered through a door in the passage. It was in the thick of this warren of houses that Jack the Ripper would commit his most savage assault.
Joe? Joe?
No,
What else can we do?
I don't care. You're not going back out there again. And I'm not having them filthy, stinking whores back here neither.
The couple broke up. Mary had no alternative but to return to selling her body on the streets. On the night of her death, Mary was drinking, and in the course of the evening met a series of men, one of whom could have been Jack the Ripper. At 11:45, she picked up a man. She was seen by another prostitute, Mary Ann Cox, a widow who lived at 5 Miller's Court. She described the man as about 36 years old, 5 foot 5 inches tall, with a fresh complexion and blotches on his face. He had a thick, carroty moustache and was dressed in shabby dark clothes and a black felt hat. He was holding a quart can of beer.
Have a song.
Mary was still singing at 12:30 a.m. Mary Ann Cox had gone out looking for customers, but returned to her room after half an hour. There was a light on in Mary's room, and she was still singing. At about 2 a.m., Mary Jane was back on the streets. A man named George Hutchinson spoke to her in Commercial Street, and from his account, it would seem that she'd sobered up considerably.
Hutchinson, could you lend me sixpence?
Sorry, Mary, I spent it all going to Romford.
Must go and find some money.
Mary walked off, and according to Hutchinson, she was approached by a man of Jewish appearance, wearing a soft felt hat pulled down over his eyes. He wore a long, dark coat trimmed with astrakhan, and sported a large gold chain in his waistcoat. He was holding kid gloves and a small package. Hutchinson followed the couple and saw them enter Mary Jane's room. Perhaps hoping that their business would soon be over and that Mary Jane would take pity on him, Hutchinson waited for nearly an hour. His story is lent weight by the testimony of a passer-by who saw a man standing where Hutchinson claimed to have been. At about 4 o'clock, Elizabeth Prater was awakened by her cat, Diddles, and heard a faint cry of, "Oh, murder!" Such exclamations were fairly common in the East End, and she took no notice. The next morning, Kelly's landlord sent an agent to collect some rent money. It was 10:45. There was no reply to the knock on Kelly's door, so he looked through the window. And in the gloom of that tiny room, he saw Mary Kelly on her bed. She had been quite literally butchered. The police were called, and when they eventually gained entry to the room, they were greeted by a nightmare turned reality.
He cuts her throat from left to right, right back to the spinal column. He cuts her from vagina to breastbone, like the other victims. He takes out her heart. He then cut off her breasts with circular incisions, put one by her head, one by her feet. He cut off her stomach flesh in 3 flaps and put that on the bedside table. Sliced off her chin, her lips, her nose, her eyebrows, her eyelids, skins her cheeks, skins her forehead, completely disfiguring this corpse. And if that's not enough, he then slices off the flesh from her thighs, and you can see the exposed bones in the photograph we have.
It was an attack on everything. Every part of the body was attacked. He had obviously had time and opportunity to indulge in his wishes. I mean, it was an attack against the whole body, against everything.
He's fulfilling his cycle of hatred, and at long last, he's got the facility to do it. A room in which he can work for about 15, 20 minutes, which is what it would have taken him to inflict those mutilations without anybody coming along and disturbing him.
Please forgive me for the implication that I'm praising it, but it was Jack's masterpiece. Having done what he did in that room, I think that he could certainly take a break.
In the wake of the attack, the head of the CID at Scotland Yard, Robert Anderson, asked the highly respected police surgeon of A Division, Dr. Thomas Bond, to undertake the post-mortem and to review the reports of the previous crimes. Dr. Bond's report included his opinion of what sort of man the killer would be. It is generally regarded as being the first attempt at criminal profiling. Bond carefully sifted through the available evidence from the previous murders, studying the medical evidence and the eyewitness statements. He concluded that at least 5 of the women had been killed by the same person.
By a knife, used violently.
Their throats cut from left to right while they were lying down.
There were 2 distinct clean cuts on the left side of the spine. They were parallel with each other.
He also concluded that none of the women appeared to have struggled, from which it was deduced that the attack had been sudden. He described the killer as a man of physical strength, cool and daring, but in appearance
quite likely to be a quiet, inoffensive-looking man, probably middle-aged and neatly and respectably dressed. He would probably be solitary and eccentric in his habits, was probably without regular occupation, possibly living among respectable people who suspected that he was not quite right in his mind at times.
Obviously the work was that of an expert.
However, a butcher could perhaps possess this knowledge.
And unlike some of the previous expert medical witnesses, Bond did not think that the murderer had any anatomical knowledge, not even that of a butcher or a horse slaughterer. Instead, he believed the simple object of the murderer, as seen in its most extreme form in the murder of Mary Kelly, was the mutilation. News of Mary Kelly's death and Jack the Ripper's unparalleled levels of savagery shocked people around the world. It was compounded by the news that same day that the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, Sir Charles Warren, had resigned. The inquest into Mary Kelly's death opened on the 12th of November, this time under a new coroner to the case, Dr. Roderick MacDonald. Much to everyone's surprise, he concluded the inquest in a day.
The fact that the inquest was over with so quickly did starve the press of the lurid speculation of going after witnesses, of finding out things. And so, rather than escalate after what was the most vicious of the Jack the Ripper killings, on the contrary, the press reportage begins to sort of fizzle out.
What we do know is that there were more murders, and that some could have been the work of Jack.
The very nature of serial killing is that you don't stop unless you're forced to do it for one reason or another.
First, the murder of Rose Milet, whose body was discovered in Poplar that December. Though apparently strangled, just as the Ripper's victims appeared to be, she wasn't mutilated. The head of the CID, Robert Anderson, certainly didn't believe the Ripper had anything to do with it.
And but not for the Jack the Ripper scare, no one would have thought of suggesting that it was a homicide.
Then there was the killing of Alice Mackenzie in the middle of the following year. This one bore all the classic signs of the Ripper's signature.
Her throat had been cut, or rather stabbed, and there were abdominal mutilations. Dr. Thomas Bond stated that he thought she was a Ripper victim.
The discovery of a woman's dismembered torso in September 1889 in an area surprisingly close to Berners Street sparked yet another Ripper scare. But the final significant Whitechapel murder occurred in February 1891. Swallow Gardens had once been a rural location, but by 1888 it was little more than an alley running under a railway arch. It was here that young Frances Coles was found with her throat cut.
The immediate suspect was a sailor by the name of James Thomas Sadler. He and Coles had actually spent several days together going around various pubs getting drunk. They'd argued, they'd split up. Within an hour of Frances Coles' body being discovered, he'd actually turned up at a lodging house, a little bit dishevelled and bloodstained. Then the police arrested him on suspicion of having murdered Frances Coles.
All right, now come on, lads. Smarten up.
He was even put into an identification parade, although he wasn't subsequently identified.
Although press interest waned, the police continued their investigation. Two senior city detectives, Cox and Sagar, both later gave accounts of suspects they believed to have been Jack the Ripper.
We had many people under observation while the murders were being perpetrated. Certain investigations made by several of our cleverest detectives made it apparent to us that a man living in the East End of London was not unlikely to have been connected with the crimes. The man that we suspected was about 5'6" in height. He occupied several shops in the East End of London, but from time to time he became insane.
Suspicion fell upon a man who, without a doubt, was the murderer. Identification being impossible, he was not charged. He was, however, put into a lunatic asylum and the atrocities came to an end.
The murder of Frances Coles marked the official closure of the police investigation of the Whitechapel murders.
The Ripper files were closed in 1892, 4 years after the murders. Because there had been no solution, the case papers were simply put away, which just means that they could have been reactivated at any time if any new information came forward.
For the last 100 years, the question of who is Jack the Ripper has been one of the greatest unsolved puzzles in the annals of crime, generating volumes of comment, analysis and speculation. But in fact, there were a number of suspects, and some senior policemen actually believed that they knew the identity of Jack the Ripper. The casebook of 14 unsolved murders, the police continue to examine the evidence, and several believed that they had the answer to Britain's biggest unsolved crime.
In 1913, the journalist George Sims wrote to the then retired Chief Inspector John Littlechild and asked him if he was familiar with a Dr. D in connection with the Jack the Ripper murders.
Littlechild wrote back,
I never heard of Dr. D, but amongst the suspects, and to my mind a very likely one, was Dr. T, which sounds much like D. He was an American quack named Tumblety, and was one time a frequent visitor to London.
Dr. Francis Tumblety was wildly eccentric and dressed flamboyantly, often wearing a uniform, and was noted for his huge moustache. He was also homosexual at a time when it was illegal.
He was arrested for acts of gross indecency with several men, but he skipped bail and he eventually returned to America.
It's very rare for homosexual serial killers to kill women. Their victims tend to be other homosexuals.
The press in the States were particularly interested in him, especially as a potential Ripper suspect, and this is something he touched on himself in a subsequent interview.
My guilt was very plain to the English mind. It is the universal belief amongst the English lower classes that all Americans wear slouch hats. Therefore, Jack the Ripper must wear a slouch hat. This, together with the fact that I am an American, was enough to convince the British police that I was Jack the Ripper.
He skipped bail on November the 7th, 1888. Now, if he was on his way out of England pretty soon afterwards, then that would question his potential guilt in the Mary Kelly murder.
Melville Macnaghten, who had been Assistant Chief Constable of the Metropolitan Police just after the murders, wrote a report in 1894 naming two probable suspects. Their names were Druitt and Kosminski.
Montague John Druitt was a barrister who was also working as a school teacher at a school in Blackheath. He was dismissed, for reasons we don't know for certain why, from his position as a school teacher at the end of November 1888, and shortly after that he committed suicide.
Melville Macnaghten said that Druitt was sexually insane and hinted at information that suggested his own family thought he was the Ripper.
A Mr. M.J. Druitt, said to be a doctor and of good family, who disappeared at the time of the Miller's Court murder, whose body, which was said to have been upwards of a month in the water, was found in the Thames on 31st of December. He was sexually insane, and from private info, I have little doubt but that his own family believed him to have been the murderer.
Macnaghten favoured Druitt as Jack the Ripper, but today nobody knows why. What we do know is that if Druitt was the murderer, he must have been a very cool customer. Within hours of the murder of Annie Chapman, just a few miles away in Blackheath, he was playing cricket. As for Macnaghten's other suspect, the man known as Kosminski...
Kosminski, a Polish Jew and resident in Whitechapel. This man became insane owing to many years' indulgence in solitary vices. He had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class, and had strong homicidal tendencies. He was removed to a lunatic asylum about March 1889. There are many circumstances connected with this man which made him a strong suspect.
What we do know is that Robert Anderson, the head of the CID at the time of the murders, later wrote in his autobiography that not only was Jack the Ripper a Polish Jew,
Very interesting.
but that he had been positively identified by an eyewitness.
That undiscovered murders in London are rare, and the Jack the Ripper crimes are not within that category.
The only person who had ever had a good view of the murderer unhesitatingly identified the suspect the instant he was confronted with him. But he refused to give evidence against him. I am almost tempted to disclose the identity of the murderer, but no public benefit would result from such a course.
In saying that he was a Polish Jew, I am merely stating a definitely ascertained fact.
To the frustration of historians, Robert Anderson did not name his suspect. But Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, the man who had overall responsibility for the investigation, did. In 1987, Donald Swanson's personal copy of Anderson's autobiography came to light.
Donald Sutherland Swanson was my great-grandfather. The book by Anderson had been found with my great-grandfather's notes in it. They seemed to me the correct and sober reflections of the man, above all, who knew most about the case of anybody, and that what he wrote was genuine and correct.
Swanson had made some penciled notes in the margins and on the end papers of the book, and he named Anderson's suspect as Kosminski.
Both Anderson and Swanson say that there was a witness identification of the suspect.
The witness refused to give evidence against the suspect, and the police were forced to release him.
On the suspect's return to his brother's house in Whitechapel, he was watched by police, city CID, by day and night.
But his family almost immediately committed him to a lunatic asylum. Robert Anderson did not name his suspect, but McNaughton and Swanson called him Kosminski. But who was Kosminski? A careful search of the asylum records by the author Martin Fido produced only one Kosminski, Aaron Kosminski.
The Kosminskis were not a poor family. They were master tailors, and they did make a reasonable living and income in the East End of London.
The family ran a tailoring business in Greenfield Street in 1888, and it's probable that Aaron lived there, placing him at the epicentre of the crimes and only a matter of 600 yards from the murder of Elizabeth Stride. In 1890, his brother Wolfe had admitted him to the workhouse infirmary, where he was described as having been insane for 2 years. Though quickly released, in 1891, his family had him committed to the Middlesex County Lunatic Asylum, Colney Hatch.
He declares that he is guided, and his movements altogether controlled by an instinct that informs his mind. He says he knows the whereabouts of all mankind. Jacob Cohen says that he walks about the streets and picks up bits of bread from the gutter and eats them, and he refuses food from the hands of others. He took a knife and threatened the life of his sister. He has not attempted any kind of work in years.
It is clear that by 1891, when Kosminski was admitted to the asylum, that he was not well enough to have committed the murders attributed to Jack the Ripper. But that did not mean that he might not have been capable 2 years earlier.
Is it the Kosminski of 1888? We know, for example, that in 1889, that Kosminski had appeared in court charged with not having his dog muzzled in public.
Mr. Kosminski, why did you give a false name?
I goes by the name of Abrahams because Kosminski is hard to spell.
And in court he came across as very lucid. So obviously there's been a great deterioration in his condition from 1889 to 1891 when he goes into the asylum.
The diagnosis I've reached, also taking into account what happened further down the line, is that he suffered from a form of schizophrenia, which I would call hebephrenic schizophrenia. People suffering from schizophrenia are not more likely than other people in society to commit violent crimes.
There are occasions when schizophrenics can become extremely dangerous. A classic example here is Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. Anderson and Swanson both appear to have believed he was the murderer. And they were in the position to know the evidence against all the major suspects. He's one of the suspects who we know was in the area at the time. He was schizophrenic, possibly psychotic, and also he's of the right age for a serial killer. So Aaron Kosminski certainly has to be high up on the list of suspects for the mantle of Jack the Ripper.
Did Jack the Ripper escape the clutches of the law because his family committed him to an asylum? We may never know. But we have followed the footsteps of Jack the Ripper into the dark labyrinth of London's past. We've met some of the men who the police believe to be the Ripper. We've revealed how he was an opportunistic killer who acted swiftly and must have had local knowledge. Above all, we have witnessed the extreme chances he was prepared to take and concluded it was only a matter of luck that he was not caught red-handed at his terrible deeds. And it is perhaps this simple fact above all that explains why, today, his name has become a legend, the most famous serial killer in history.